I want to talk a little bit about the Communist Manifesto that's here in your textbook, or a portion of it. Um, One of the things you'll find when you look at people who disagree about how to combat some kind of social situation or injustice or circumstance that's not good is that they by and large agree on the problem. Where they disagree is on the solution. Um, and what Marx and Engels were looking at in London, which is where they were meeting in a pub and talking about these things and laying the foundation for communism, they were looking at particularly brutal circumstances, just absolutely atrocious. Um, Child labor, kids getting chewed up in factory machinery, people being paid starvation wages, paid as little as possible, just to keep them alive long enough to continue to work at the machinery. This was killing people. It was grinding people up. Um, and no one could defend it. The people who did defend it were generally the people who were wealthy, and which there were fewer and fewer of as um, industrialization concentrated wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And they largely defended it on grounds of social Darwinism. The idea that poor people are obviously less suited to survive, that they kind of veiled themselves in some pseudoscience to justify their um, behavior. And so when Marx and Engels were considering a solution to this problem, the problem was horrible, and uh, they did not dream that they would replace it with something worse, which they did do. I have spent a lot of time in communist Europe back when it was still there, and it's a nightmare. It's worse in many ways than the industrialization and the exploitation that it replaced. Um, One of the mistakes that Marx made is in history. Um, he looked at the medieval system as kind of an ideal, which it was when it came to um, the ordinary person being able to make it in the world. In the Middle Ages, you had the guild system, and the guild system basically uh, organized different skills of labor into these guilds. And there would be, we have words left over from this, masterpiece, right? Something produced by a master craftsman. This is what the people who were highest ranked in the guilds would be. We have the word journeyman, right? A journeyman would be somebody who was not quite a master, but not an apprentice, but they were skilled at their labor and they were working their way to becoming masters and being able to produce masterpieces. Um, and we had the apprentices. It was a system of making sure that everyone had the means to make a living. And you did not have this broken down division of labor, and you certainly didn't have machinery which aided in that. You didn't have one factory making table legs and another factory making tabletops. Um, all of them on machines, and one person pulling, several hundreds of people pulling different levers at machinery. You had a table maker who was making tables. Some of our names come from this era. Wagoner, for instance, as a last name, comes from the Guild of the Wagoners, the people who built wagons. And as you can imagine, when you have something that's handmade by one person who is incredibly skilled at their craft and is in a system that rewards that skill, you had some really, really wonderful things being made. And it was a way that everyone could find a way to make a living. Um, Now, Marx blames the downfall of this system on capitalism and industrialization. Um, but that's not why that system fell apart. The system fell apart because of the Protestant Reformation. That system of guilds was held in place. It was part and parcel of Christendom, of which was Roman Catholic Christianity. All of these guilds would have had saints that they were their patrons, and you can still look this up. There's a patron saints of all these different kinds of activities of crafts and of commerce. And so these guilds were unified in that way. They were unified in a kind of faith. The Protestant Reformation happened, and I think I mentioned earlier that it opened the door for the nobility to plunder the church. And one of the things that they plundered was the guild system. The guild system lost the church's support, and the nobility, who were enriched by this plunder, saw the guild system as a check on their power, which it was. You have organized labor. Now, these weren't unions like we have now. These were guilds, and they're stronger than unions in many ways. Um, and so the nobility, who had enriched themselves on taking over Catholic property and wealth, then began to disband the guild system, and that's what wrecked it. And so that opened the door then for the nightmare of descent into this industrialized nightmare where you have no protections whatsoever on individual worker. If you were one of the wagoners in the Wagoner Guild and you could build a great wagon, right, you were doing great. And if you built a masterpiece wagon, you could probably sell it for a whole lot. Um, when you're just one of the guys working in the factory that's building one spoke for the wheel, um, you don't have anything to sell anymore. You're just basically, um, for those of you who have seen The Matrix, right? The Matrix is in many ways uh, it's a almost like a morality play. It's an allegory. Um, when Neo wakes up and comes into what the world really is like, he's a battery. He's just a battery. The living energy of his body is being used to support this machine. Well, that's what people were in these factory systems, and so Marx and Engels are looking at this, going, "What? We can't keep this going. We have to do something about it." But their solution ended up being its own kind of nightmare, which is one of the worst tragedies of the 20th century, was the spread of communism and the fervor that people embraced communism arose from the terrible conditions that they were living in. Look, if you're one of these batteries, if you're hooked to the machine and it's sucking the life out of you, and your 5-year-old daughter was chewed up in the machinery at one of the factories, you're going to be ready to do something about it. And when somebody comes along with a very um, detailed and philosophically thought out solution to that problem, it's easy to see why people would glom onto that and decide, we're going to rebel. We're going to change this system. We're going to do something else. And so that's how communism first started and spread. And capitalism is as much to blame for this as anything else. Had the factory owners and workers, had anybody had some kind of consideration for the people actually working, and not simply maximizing profits at all costs, uh, the communists wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. They wouldn't have had any terrible social conditions to point to and say, this has to end. And so it's easy to blame communism, and like I said, communism it's a bad thing. I have been in some very dark places on this planet, and Timișoara, Romania, under the Ceausescu regime back in the communist days, was it's as bad as it gets. And I saw some things there that are just seared on my memory. I will never forget. One of them was some starving old ladies, and in Romania, under a socialist system, communist system, everyone had a job. That's what they could boast. 100% employment. And these ladies, they had a job, and their job was sweeping the concrete in front of the statues. And they had these brooms that were made out of twigs, and they were just they were terrible. And it was, and they're sweeping away at the base of this giant statue of Ceausescu. And many of these communist systems devolved into kind of this cults of personality of their leaders. And the statue at the base said, what did it say? Prosperity, heroism, socialism, Ceausescu. And I'm like, ah. This is terrible. Um, and so when I talk about how communism rose out of the destructiveness of capitalism, I'm not at all suggesting communism is a good thing. It's manifestly not. But you have to understand how bad things were, that people would take this as an answer to the problem. And so that's what I want to say about the Communist Manifesto.